My mother-in-law humiliated me with cruel jokes disguised as humor for 10 years at every family event, but I've had enough. It all started on the day I married Blake. The wedding was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, but instead, it became the first in a long line of uncomfortable family gatherings that I would dread every single year. Dorothy, my mother-in-law, thought she was hilarious. Everyone else just thought she was cruel. At the reception, she stood up to give a toast, a moment that should have been filled with joy and love. Instead, she looked at me and said, "I'm surprised Blake found someone willing to marry him for love instead of money. Since, he doesn't have any." There were some nervous laughs, but I could feel the heat rising in my face. I wanted to shrink into the floor. Blake gave a weak smile, as if he never heard that kind of joke before, and I tried to laugh it off, pretending it didn't sting, but it did. For the next 10 years the jokes continued. At every birthday, holiday, and family dinner, Dorothy made sure her humor took center stage, and I was always the target. She would introduce me as Blake's first wife and laugh, saying she was kidding. But behind the joke, I always wondered if the punchline held a grain of truth. I remember one Christmas when she made a joke about my gifts being cheap because, as she put it, teachers don't make real money. Another time, she cracked a joke about my cooking, saying I'd probably eat everyone's leftovers. At first, I would laugh it off, trying to be the good sport. But the jokes got worse, and I started to feel like a walking punchline. When our daughter, Lily, was born premature, spending weeks in the ICU, Dorothy visited once and made a joke about Lily, trying to escape already. She said, maybe the baby knew something we didn't about her parents. I was stunned. Blake told her to stop, but she just laughed and said he'd lost his sense of humor since marrying me. It wasn't just me. Dorothy would joke about how my children weren't smart enough for certain things or how I was always too serious. It was as though she found joy in seeing me squirm. She made a show of being the funny one while I tried to keep the peace. By the time Lily turned 5, I had had enough. This wasn't just a few jokes anymore, it was a pattern. Every family event became a stage for Dorothy's humor, and I was the one who was always under attack. But at that birthday, as she made another joke about Lily's appearance and my parenting, something snapped. I decided then that I would stop reacting. I wouldn't play along, laugh it off, or feel embarrassed anymore. This would be the last time I let Dorothy's humor, her cruelty, define my family gatherings. I wasn't going to take it any longer. The next time she cracked a joke, I just kept stirring my soup, carrying on as if nothing had been said. I didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't get upset. And I could feel it. The change, the silence that followed her words. I wasn't sure how this would play out, but I knew one thing for sure: I was done. Done being the punchline. Done playing along. Done pretending it didn't hurt. The next family dinner was a week after I decided to stop reacting. I could feel the tension building inside me. I wasn't sure how this would play out, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to laugh. I wasn't going to give Dorothy the satisfaction of seeing me hurt anymore. It was a quiet Wednesday evening, the kind where the night feels like it's already wrapped in a blanket of soft, steady light. The smell of food wafted from the kitchen, and I could hear the clinking of silverware as everyone began to settle around the dinner table. There was the usual chatter, the comfortable buzz of a family gathering, but my mind was a storm. I kept replaying the decision I'd made, wondering if I could follow through. Blake didn't know what I was planning. I hadn't told him. I didn't want him to worry, and I wasn't sure how he'd react. I could feel his nervous glances every time Dorothy opened her mouth, but I kept my face neutral. We'd had our talks before, and he knew about the tension, but now, for the first time, it wasn't just me trying to make things better. This time, I was taking control of my own reaction, or rather, my lack of one. As usual, Dorothy entered with her signature smile, a bit too wide, a bit too eager. The moment she saw me, I knew she was already thinking of her material. I could practically see her eyes scanning me for a fresh joke, something to get everyone laughing. Even if it meant at my expense. She started with a comment about my outfit. "Oh, Seth, I didn't realize you were still dressing like it was the 90s. You could be a little more adventurous with your wardrobe." The room fell silent for a second. Richard, sitting next to me, cleared his throat awkwardly. Amy, ever the peacemaker, suddenly had something urgent to check on in the kitchen. But there was no way I was giving her the laugh she so desperately wanted. I didn't flinch, I didn't even smile. I simply kept cutting my vegetables, focusing on the task in front of me as if she hadn't spoken. She repeated the comment, louder this time. "Seth, really, I think the whole family's starting to notice. You should really update your wardrobe. No offense, but you're starting to look like you walked off the set of a retro TV show." I asked Amy about her new job, ignoring Dorothy completely. It wasn't a power play. It wasn't to be dramatic. I just didn't have the energy to participate in her cruelty anymore. Dorothy looked around the table, a flicker of frustration passing over her face as she saw no one joining in on the joke. Richard shifted in his seat, Blake's gaze avoided her, and Amy focused intently on something just beyond Dorothy's reach. The silence grew thicker with each of her jokes landing like stones dropped into water, splashes that no one acknowledged. She kept pushing, making louder comments about my cooking, about my supposed inability to make a decent meal. Probably poisoning everyone with that, huh, Seth? She said, louder now, her voice almost pleading for some sort of reaction. Still, I just looked at her as if nothing had changed, as if her jokes were meaningless, as if they couldn't touch me. Her face reddened, and I could see the desperation beginning to rise in her. Her jokes grew more insistent, more obvious, like she was trying harder to provoke a reaction. She repeated herself. Come on, Seth. Aren't you gonna laugh at least? You know it's just a joke, right? I asked Richard about his latest gardening project, keeping my voice calm and steady. I wasn't trying to shut her down, I was simply refusing to engage in the dance that she always led. The rest of the dinner went like that, Dorothy's jokes becoming increasingly louder and more awkward. But every single time, I didn't respond. It was painful for her, and it was painful for me too. The absence of my laughter, my response, made the room feel like it was filled with tension. Dorothy was used to being the center of attention, to everyone laughing at her sharp wit. Now, her humor felt like a heavy weight hanging in the air, but no one was willing to lift it. As the meal ended, Blake looked at me with a quiet mix of confusion and relief. I could see it in his eyes. He knew I was doing something important, but he wasn't sure how long I could hold out. After dinner, Dorothy's behavior shifted. She started complaining to the rest of the family that I was giving her the silent treatment. Blake calmly explained that I wasn't ignoring her, just not engaging in the jokes anymore. Richard looked over at me, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. He cleared his throat again, but this time it felt less awkward. Like the silence was the kind of tension they'd lived with for years, and now it was different. Blake turned to me, giving me a gentle squeeze on the shoulder. It was a gesture of support, but also a silent recognition of what was unfolding between us. Later that evening, after everyone had left, I found myself replaying the dinner in my mind. It hadn't gone perfectly. It hadn't been some kind of victory, but it had been a start. It was the first time in years that Dorothy's jokes hadn't shaped the evening. The first time I hadn't been forced to either laugh along or feel humiliated. And for the first time, I felt like I had reclaimed a piece of my own power. The following week, we found ourselves at Dorothy's retirement party. It was supposed to be a celebration, but I had no illusions about what the evening might hold. The party was at a rented hall with 100 people scattered around, chatting and clinking glasses. It had a slightly too loud buzz. The hum of too many people trying to be heard over each other. The air smelled faintly of perfume cologne, and the faint traces of dinner lingering in the background. Blake and I arrived together, both of us quietly bracing for what was to come. The only comfort I had was that, for the first time, I wasn't going to play along. Dorothy had been bragging for weeks about her special material, jokes she had planned about our family. She was going to bring the whole crowd into her act, and I wasn't going to be her punching bag anymore. Blake was nervous. I could tell by the way his hands gripped the sides of his drink. He tried to make light of it, but I knew he was just as unsure as I was. When Dorothy finally made her way through the crowd, the familiar eager sparkle was in her eyes. She was trying to be the life of the party, touching shoulders, laughing with colleagues. But there was an underlying tension in her movements. Her eyes kept darting back to Blake and me, like she was waiting for the signal, the moment when we'd all start playing along with her jokes. I kept my distance from her, my focus on small talk with Richard, who had given up on trying to hide his discomfort around Dorothy's humor. The speeches began shortly after we arrived, and I found myself dreading what was to come next. It started innocuously enough. Dorothy gave a short speech about her time working at the office. Her colleagues chuckled at the harmless anecdotes she shared, about the quirky things that happened in the office, and how she always managed to make things fun. The room seemed to relax as Dorothy's confidence built with every laugh, and for a moment, it felt like maybe this time, I wouldn't be the target. But then, she turned her attention to Blake. Blake shifted uncomfortably as Dorothy began talking about him. Blake, she said, her voice light and teasing. Who's to hide vegetables in his napkin at dinner when he was a kid? Guess that's why he doesn't mind eating so much of my cooking. The crowd laughed, polite, almost too polite. I could feel Blake's discomfort. He fidgeted in his seat, but he didn't interrupt. Dorothy had made Blake the punchline before, and this time was no different. But I wasn't going to laugh. I wasn't going to play along. Dorothy smiled, obviously pleased with herself, and continued. And of course, Blake could have married his ex Rachel. She was perfectly nice, but I guess she didn't have the patience for him, huh? My stomach twisted. I could feel the heat rising to my face. The joke was old, and I'd heard it 100 times. This time, I wasn't gonna laugh. Instead, I looked over at Blake. He met my gaze, his eyes showing a mix of resignation and frustration. I forced myself to stay calm to ignore the jab, but the room was quiet now. Dorothy didn't seem to notice the shift in energy. And then there's Seth, Dorothy said with a little too much cheer, turning the spotlight onto me. He's really something. A teacher, of course. Just like Blake, always doing the right thing. She paused. Too bad he doesn't have the same sense of humor as the rest of us. I sat still, my hands clenched on the edge of the chair, but I said nothing. I couldn't. This was the moment. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Richard shifted uncomfortably beside me. Amy, sitting across the table, looked down, pretending to focus on her drink. Blake, too, seemed lost in thought. The polite laughs from earlier had stopped. Dorothy seemed to realize something was off but pressed on, oblivious. Her next words hit harder than I expected. Seth, I'm just kidding, of course. You know that. You always get so serious about everything. Lighten up, it's just a joke. I didn't respond. I didn't even look at her. Blake glanced at me, and I could see the frustration building in his eyes. He looked down at his plate, then back up at Dorothy. It was like watching a man caught between loyalty to his mother and the knowledge that what she was doing was wrong. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. Dorothy continued her performance, but it didn't have the same energy anymore. No one joined in her jokes, and the laughter felt strained. It was like she was trying to force everyone to laugh, but no one wanted to. Blake and I didn't speak much for the rest of the night. I could feel his discomfort, but he didn't say anything until we were in the car, heading home. I'm sorry, he said quietly, his voice tight. I should have stopped her. I shook my head. No, Blake. You don't need to apologize. She's the one who needs to change, not you. We drove in silence for a while. The weight of the evening was heavy between us, but there was also a sense of relief. Dorothy's performance had been exposed, and for the first time, I hadn't played along. The question was, though, what would happen next? Would she finally see the damage she'd caused, or would it take something more to make her realize that this behavior couldn't go on? The next few days were a blur. The retirement party had left a weight in the air that didn't seem to dissipate. I kept replaying the conversation Blake and I had in the car, the look in his eyes when he apologized for not stopping Dorothy sooner. But it wasn't his fault. I knew he was stuck in the middle, torn between his mother and me, and I wasn't sure how to help him with that. We tried to move forward as best as we could, but the family dynamics were shifting, and I wasn't sure where they were heading. Dorothy didn't apologize, at least not directly, and the awkwardness hung between us all. Blake and I didn't talk much about what had happened at the party, but I could tell it was weighing on him too. He'd never seen his mother quite like that, exposed in a way she couldn't brush off with a joke. The following weekend we were supposed to attend another family dinner, this time at Richard and Dorothy's house. Blake looked at me in the morning, his expression tight with uncertainty. You okay with this? He asked, his voice softer than usual. I nodded, though my stomach was in knots. I'll be fine. But I knew that wasn't completely true. There was still this undercurrent of tension between us and Dorothy, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. I was ready to hold my ground, but what if she tried to manipulate me again? What if she turned it into another performance? We arrived at their house, and it immediately felt different. The usual warmth of Dorothy's home, always chaotic and full of loud conversations, was replaced with a strange stillness. The smell of roasting chicken and vegetables was comforting, but it didn't fill the space the way it usually did. There was no laughter or chatter, just the faint sound of the oven's hum and the clinking of dishes as Richard set the table. When Dorothy appeared, she looked subdued. Her usual energy was gone. Instead of the bright, almost theatrical entrance she always made, she seemed hesitant, almost as if she was waiting for something, or maybe someone. She gave us a tight smile, and the air felt awkward as we all settled into our seats. Blake's hand rested gently on mine as I sat down, a quiet gesture that spoke volumes. I knew he was waiting for her to make the first move, to see if she would revert to her old self. We all were, in a way. Dinner began, and Dorothy stayed mostly quiet. She asked about the kids, mentioned something about the weather, but it felt like she was walking on eggshells. No jokes. No sarcastic remarks about my cooking or the way I looked. It was like she was trying to behave, but there was no warmth in her words, no usual snappy humor that had once filled the space. It was uncomfortable in its own way. Dorothy's silence felt like a weight on the table. The food was good, better than I expected, but it didn't have the usual lightness, the ease we had at family dinners before. We all ate in near silence, exchanging the occasional glance, unsure of what to say. Then, as I was finishing my meal, Dorothy spoke again. Her voice was softer than usual. "I've been thinking," she started, her eyes on her plate, "about what happened at my party." I looked at her, surprised. She didn't look up, but I could tell she was trying to say something important. Blake didn't respond immediately. He just waited, his hands folded in his lap, as if he was unsure of how to proceed. I didn't realize how much I hurt everyone," Dorothy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it was all just fun, you know. I thought everyone liked the jokes." Her words hung in the air, and for a second, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was she really acknowledging the damage she'd done? Blake shifted in his seat, clearly caught off guard. He hadn't expected this kind of conversation. "It's not about the jokes, Mom," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's about how they've made us feel, how they've hurt Seth, how they've hurt all of us." Dorothy nodded, her eyes still focused on the food. "I don't know what happened to me," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I just wanted to be funny. I didn't know I was making everyone uncomfortable. And I didn't realize how much I hurt Seth until that speech at my party." The mention of the speech made my heart skip a beat. Blake's words, the truth he'd spoken so plainly, had hit her harder than I realized. Dorothy had always been the one in control, always using humor as a shield. But now, for the first time, I saw a crack in that armor. "I'm sorry," she added, looking up at me for the first time. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't realize how much I was doing it." The apology wasn't perfect. It wasn't the one I had expected, but it was a start. I didn't say anything right away. I just looked at her, taking in her words. It was the first time I had heard her speak with any real remorse. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was just the target of her jokes. Blake squeezed my hand under the table, a silent acknowledgement that something had shifted. Maybe this wasn't the moment everything would change, but it was a step in the right direction. Dorothy wasn't ready to fully own her actions yet, but at least she was starting to see the impact of her behavior. For the rest of the evening, Dorothy didn't make any jokes. She didn't try to be funny. It was almost too quiet, but at least it was real. The atmosphere wasn't filled with forced laughter or awkward silences where we pretended everything was okay. It was just dinner. Just family. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like we might actually have the chance to heal. After we finished cleaning up, Dorothy stood by the door, her hand resting on the frame. "I'm really trying, you know," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I know I've messed up, but I want to try to do better." I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words. I wasn't sure if this change would last, but I was willing to give her the chance to prove it. Blake and I left that night feeling a mix of cautious hope and lingering doubt. Maybe things were starting to change, but the real test would come in the days and months ahead. For now, though, it was a start, and that was enough. The days after that dinner were a strange kind of quiet. Dorothy's apology had left me with mixed emotions: relief, skepticism, hope, but mostly confusion. I wasn't sure if it was a genuine turning point or just a temporary lull in her usual behavior. Blake and I didn't speak much about it, but the weight of it hung over us. Every interaction felt like a test. Blake tried to lighten the mood. "You think she'll keep it up?" he asked one evening, his voice tentative. He looked at me, half expecting an answer but not sure what to expect from me. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I really don't know." We'd been walking on eggshells for years, and now everything felt fragile. Dorothy was trying, or at least, she seemed to be, but I didn't want to get my hopes up. The reality was, she'd hurt me too many times to believe it would change after one conversation. Blake kept his distance from his mother for a while, unsure of how to navigate the new dynamic. I could tell he was torn. He loved his mother, but he also hated seeing me hurt. He kept bringing up the past, thinking about things that were said, rehashing the old arguments. It wasn't easy for him to shift his mindset either. After a few weeks of uncertainty, we found ourselves back at another family gathering. This time, it was for Lily's 6th birthday. Dorothy insisted on coming, even after everything that had happened. Blake and I were both hesitant. We had set boundaries before, but we weren't sure if we'd be able to follow through if she slipped back into old habits. The party was at our house. The smell of cake and the sound of kids running around filled the air. It should have been a simple, happy celebration, but it felt different this time. Dorothy was there, sitting quietly, watching everything unfold. She made a few attempts at conversation, asking about Lily's schoolwork and how she was doing. It wasn't much, but it was a start. There were no cutting remarks about my parenting or questions about whether I could keep up with the demands of raising a 6-year-old. For the most part, it was a peaceful day. But I couldn't help but stay alert, always watching, waiting for that familiar bite of her humor. Every time she looked at me, I half expected her to make some cruel joke, to slip back into the comfort of her usual behavior. But the joke never came. Blake was still on edge. He kept watching his mother out of the corner of his eye, waiting for her to say something inappropriate. But as the day went on, nothing happened. Dorothy seemed normal. She was quieter than usual, but she didn't try to dominate the room with her humor. She didn't need to be the center of attention. She helped serve the cake, complimented Lily on her drawing, and even told me how much she liked my outfit. I wasn't sure what to make of it. The moment that really caught me off guard came toward the end of the party. After the kids had gone home and the last of the decorations were being put away, Dorothy pulled me aside. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, her voice quiet, "for letting me be part of this, even after everything." I blinked, unsure of what to say. "Of course," I replied. Dorothy nodded, her hands twisting nervously. "I know I've messed up, and I know I've hurt you. I just want you to know that I'm really trying to be better. I don't want to lose what little I have left with you." With Lily, it was the first time she had ever acknowledged how much her actions had affected me. The sincerity in her voice was hard to ignore, but I wasn't ready to fully trust it. "I appreciate you saying that," I told her, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. "But it's not going to be easy. You can't just say the words and expect everything to be okay. We've been through too much for that." She seemed to understand. "I know," she whispered, "but I'm willing to try." I looked at her for a long moment, my thoughts swirling. Was this the real Dorothy? The woman behind the jokes and the need for attention? Or was this just another one of her performances, carefully crafted for the moment? Blake had been watching from the corner of the room. He came over when he saw Dorothy and I talking. His eyes met mine, and there was a silent understanding between us. He knew this was a fragile moment, that we were both trading carefully, unsure of what would come next. "I'm proud of you," Blake said quietly to his mother, his voice steady. "But it's gonna take time. We're gonna need to see it, not just hear it." Dorothy nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I understand," she said. "I'll show you." The rest of the evening passed in a strange, almost serene silence. There was no tension, no jokes at my expense, no need for me to defend myself. It was as if a new understanding had settled in the room. It didn't feel like everything was fixed, but it felt like a step in the right direction. As Blake and I cleaned up, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Could Dorothy really change? Could she leave behind the need to make jokes at the expense of others? Or was this just another brief lull before the storm? I wasn't sure, but for the first time in years, I felt a cautious sense of hope. That night, as we sat together on the couch, Blake leaned in close. "Do you think she can really change?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know," I replied honestly, "but I'm willing to give her a chance. For now, that's all I can do." Blake nodded, his hand finding mine. "Me too." And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the weight of the past pressing down on me. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to shift. Thanksgiving arrived with an air of unease, though it was different this year. The familiar tension that usually gripped me when we walked through Dorothy's door wasn't there. Instead, it felt like a strange calm hung over us, a quiet anticipation. Blake and I had discussed what we'd do if Dorothy slipped back into old habits, if she made a cruel joke or crossed a boundary we'd set. We were both ready to leave, but part of me couldn't help but wonder if things had really changed. We drove to Dorothy's house in silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. It wasn't the usual dread I felt before family gatherings. There was a quiet hope mixed with a lingering worriness. Would she actually respect our boundaries? Or was this just another one of her performances, a temporary act she'd put on for our benefit? The moment we arrived, I was hit by a strange shift in atmosphere. The house, usually loud and chaotic, was unusually quiet. The usual smells of turkey, stuffing, and cranberry sauce filled the air, but it felt almost too perfect, too still. Dorothy was at the door, standing there with a gentle smile instead of her usual over-the-top enthusiasm. She hugged Blake first, then me, but the embrace was softer, almost tentative. "Happy Thanksgiving," she said, her voice calm and warm. "It's good to have you all here." I nodded, still uncertain how to respond. It was as if a switch had been flipped, and for the first time in years, Dorothy wasn't the one trying to make every moment about her. Dinner began, and Dorothy was quieter than I expected. She asked about Lily, about her schoolwork, and how Blake and I were doing, but there were no sharp comments or jabs. I couldn't help but keep my guard up, unsure whether it would last. As the meal progressed, there were moments when I thought I saw the old Dorothy, the one who would make a snide remark about the food or try to make a joke about me or Blake. But each time, she caught herself. It was like she was constantly second-guessing herself, trying to find the right words to avoid triggering the old patterns. Blake and I exchanged glances, both of us tense, waiting for something to happen. I kept my eyes on Dorothy, watching for any sign that she might slip back into her old ways. But instead of the usual biting humor, Dorothy seemed almost lost. It was like she didn't know how to behave anymore, now that the role she had played for so long had been taken away from her. The meal continued in an awkward but strangely peaceful silence. It wasn't comfortable, but it was new. For the first time, we were having a meal without the constant tension of Dorothy's cruel humor hanging over us. Then, as we were finishing dessert, something unexpected happened. Dorothy stood up, holding her glass of wine, and turned to the table. There was no grand announcement, no flourish, just her quiet voice cutting through the silence. "I just want to say," she began, her eyes scanning the table, "that I'm sorry. I know I've hurt all of you over the years, especially you, Seth. I've made jokes that weren't funny. I thought I was being funny, but I wasn't. I was being cruel." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't expected this level of honesty. I could feel the weight of her apology hanging in the air, and I wasn't sure how to process it. Dorothy had always been so defensive about her jokes, so wrapped up in her need for attention. To hear her acknowledge the damage she'd done, to hear her admit that she had been cruel, it was overwhelming. Blake looked at me, his expression unreadable. "We've talked about this," he said softly, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "It's not just about the jokes, Mom, it's about how you've made us feel. For years we've been walking on eggshells, wondering when the next joke would come, when the next time you'd hurt Seth or Lily or me." Dorothy nodded, her face crumpling slightly. She didn't argue or try to deflect. "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I've been so focused on making people laugh, I didn't see what it was doing to the family. I didn't see how I was pushing you all away." The room was silent, everyone watching as Dorothy fought to hold back tears. I wasn't sure what to say. I didn't expect an apology, certainly not one like this. But it felt like the beginning of something, even if I couldn't be sure where it would lead. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Dorothy continued, her voice low. "But I need you to know that I'm trying. I'm working on myself. I know it's going to take time, but I'm going to try to be better." Blake and I exchanged a glance, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that this wasn't just a fleeting moment, but a real shift. But I could see the skepticism too. "I'm proud of you for saying that," Blake said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But words aren't enough. You have to show us. We need to see that you're really changing." Dorothy nodded again, wiping at her eyes. "I will," she promised. "I'll show you." The conversation shifted then, awkwardly, as we all tried to find a way to move on. There were no more jokes, no more jabs, just an uneasy truce. For the first time, Dorothy wasn't trying to dominate the room with her humor. She wasn't trying to make everything about her. And for the first time, I felt like I could breathe. Dinner ended without incident. As we all gathered our things and prepared to leave, Dorothy stopped me at the door. "Thank you," she said, her voice small, "for giving me the chance to try." I looked at her, unsure of what to say. "It's not easy, but it's a start," I said, my voice soft but firm. "We'll see where it goes from here." She nodded, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "I know." As Blake and I walked out the door, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. It wasn't the end, but maybe it was the beginning of something different. Maybe, for the first time, there was a chance for change. The next few weeks passed in a strange, uncomfortable quiet. Thanksgiving had come and gone, and for the first time in years, there had been no major incidents. No biting jokes from Dorothy, no uncomfortable silences, no forced laughter. It was like the family had collectively agreed to act like everything was normal, but the weight of it all still lingered in the background. Blake and I talked less about Dorothy's behavior, but the change, if it was a change, was on my mind every time I saw her. There was no grand transformation, no magic moment where she became the mother-in-law I had always hoped for. But there was something different. She seemed more aware of the space she occupied in our lives, more conscious of the impact her words could have. The first test came when Blake's birthday rolled around. Dorothy offered to host dinner at her place, and for the first time, I felt the need to prepare myself. I wasn't sure if this was another test of her resolve, or if we were falling back into old habits. Blake had agreed to go and I had agreed to follow, but inside I was already bracing myself for whatever might come. As we pulled up to her house, the usual anxiety gnawed at me. I had been through enough family dinners with Dorothy to know that this would not be a calm, quiet evening. I didn't trust that the change she had promised was real, and I wasn't sure if I could bear another round of emotional manipulation or cruel jokes disguised as humor. When we walked in, I noticed a shift. Dorothy wasn't standing by the door waiting to make some joke about my outfit or my cooking. She wasn't pretending to be the center of attention. In fact, she was sitting at the dining table, already engaged in conversation with Richard. She looked normal. It was strange. She didn't greet us with a barrage of questions or sharp remarks. She stood up when we entered, but it wasn't the exaggerated performance she used to put on. There was no look at me energy. Just a simple, "Lad, you could make it. Dinner's almost ready." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. It felt like we were in uncharted territory. It wasn't the Dorothy I had come to expect, but it was still unsettling. The evening unfolded in a way that was almost too quiet. We all ate, shared stories, and talked about work and the kids. Dorothy didn't make a single joke about me or Blake, not one. After dinner, I found myself scanning the room for signs of the old Dorothy. It was like I was waiting for the mask to slip, for her to crack and make some cutting remark. But instead, we all settled into a strange, calm conversation about the weather and holiday plans. Dorothy even complimented my cooking, saying the meal was better than expected. The words themselves weren't much, but there was no sarcasm behind them, no hidden barbs. I was still on edge, unable to completely relax. There were moments when I thought Dorothy might slip up, when she would say something that didn't quite fit with the version of herself she was trying to present. But she didn't. She was polite, calm, almost normal. Blake was quieter than usual, his gaze flicking between me and his mother. I could tell he was just as unsure as I was. Was this real? Or was she just wearing another mask? We left her house that night without incident. As we drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, but I couldn't tell if it was for better or worse. Dorothy had said she was trying, but I wasn't sure if I could believe it. "I don't know what to think anymore," I said to Blake as we pulled into the driveway. "She was different tonight. But is it real? Or is she just putting on another act?" Blake sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't either. But it's better than what we've had, right?" "Maybe," I said quietly. "But it still feels like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop." Blake nodded, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. "I want to believe she's changing, but I'm scared to trust it." I understood. I felt the same way. The past had a way of coming back, of showing up in the form of a joke or a comment that would make everything feel like it was just another round of the same old game. The days after the dinner passed in a similar kind of quiet. Dorothy sent a few texts, nothing overbearing, just checking in on us, asking how things were going. There were no jokes, no barbs, no passive-aggressive comments. She wasn't trying to manipulate us, and it was unsettling. It was hard to trust, and then 3 weeks later, the phone call came. Blake answered it while I was in the kitchen. I could hear his voice drop in pitch as he listened to whatever Dorothy was saying. The unease in my stomach grew. When he hung up, he stood there for a moment, his face unreadable. "Mom wants to meet up," he said slowly, his eyes meeting mine. "She said she wants to talk." I wasn't sure what to make of it. About what? I don't know. But she sounded different, softer, like she's really trying this time. I wasn't sure I was ready for another round of trying. I didn't know if I could handle another conversation about change and apologies without seeing any actual results. But I also knew I couldn't stop Blake from meeting her. It was his mother, and he was trying to navigate this, just like I was. I nodded. "If you think it's worth it." "I don't know," Blake admitted. "But I can't keep wondering. I need to know if she's really changing or if we're just putting up with the same old thing." I couldn't argue with that. "Just be careful, okay? Don't let her pull you back in." Blake smiled faintly, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "I will, I promise." The next day Blake met with Dorothy at a small coffee shop in town. He didn't tell me much afterward, just that it had been emotional, that Dorothy had cried, and that she seemed genuinely remorseful. She had apologized again, not for the first time, but for the first time. It didn't feel like empty words. "It's not perfect," Blake said as he sat across from me at the kitchen table. "But it's something. She's trying, Seth. She really is." I looked at him, not sure what to say. I wanted to believe him, but there was still that nagging voice in the back of my head telling me to wait for the inevitable slip-up. "I'm just tired of waiting for the other shoe to drop," I admitted. Blake reached across the table and squeezed my hand.
"I know."
But neither of us knew what came next. All we could do was hold on and hope that this time, the change would stick. Over the next few months, things between Dorothy and I shifted in ways I never expected. There were moments when I caught myself holding my breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, but it didn't. The quiet was unsettling at first. It was a strange kind of peace, one that didn't feel entirely real, but it was there, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe it might last. Family dinners became easier to attend. I no longer braced myself for the cruel jabs that had once been so predictable. Dorothy still made mistakes, still caught herself before saying something sharp, but the difference was in how she handled it. Each time she slipped, she corrected herself immediately. There were no excuses, no defensiveness. She would pause, her face reddening in embarrassment, and say, "I'm sorry, that was wrong." The first time I heard her do that, I almost didn't know how to respond. It felt like a different woman was sitting at the table, one who was trying, really trying, to change. I watched her carefully, trying to decipher if this was genuine change or just another phase. But after a few weeks, something inside me started to soften. I found myself starting to believe in it, in her effort. It wasn't perfect. There were times when the old habits reared their head, and I'd feel the familiar sting of her words, but those moments became fewer and fewer. One evening, as we were all sitting around after dinner, Dorothy surprised me. We were chatting about Lily's school play when she looked at me across the table. "Seth," she said softly, "I really want to say thank you for giving me another chance. I know I've hurt you and I don't deserve it, but I've been trying to be better." I stopped mid-sentence, my fork hovering above my plate. I wasn't sure what to say. For a long time I had been waiting for this moment, but when it came I wasn't prepared. I just nodded, my throat tightening. "I can see it," I said quietly. "I can see you're trying." Blake squeezed my hand under the table, and I looked at him, seeing the same quiet disbelief in his eyes. For years he'd fought with the guilt of not standing up to his mother, of letting her treat me the way she had. But now, it was different. Now, it felt like we were all on the same side, finally. The following months passed in a cautious optimism. Dorothy's behavior wasn't flawless, but the more I saw her face the reality of her actions, the more I realized the depth of her desire to make things right. She never again made jokes at my expense, never again tried to belittle me. It was still awkward at times. There were moments when she'd try to joke and catch herself, unsure of how to entertain without hurting anyone, but she kept trying, and I kept giving her the benefit of the doubt. At Christmas, something shifted again. Dorothy, who had always insisted on hosting every holiday, surprised us by suggesting we have it at our house. She said she didn't want to control everything anymore, that it was time to let us have a turn. It was a simple gesture, but one that showed me how much she was changing. The pressure I had always felt around her was slowly, almost imperceptibly lifting. Christmas Day was quieter than usual. It was peaceful. Dorothy arrived early, wearing a soft smile, and for the first time in a long while, there was no need to entertain, no need to perform. She helped with the food, complimented me on the decorations, and even played with Lily on the floor. She didn't make any offhand remarks about my parenting or make jokes about how the presents weren't up to her usual standards. It was a normal holiday, one that didn't revolve around her. When we sat down to open presents, I could feel the shift. The old Dorothy wasn't there. She wasn't the center of attention. She wasn't performing for laughs. Instead, she was simply there, a part of our family, as we all shared in the warmth of the day. After everyone left, Dorothy stayed behind for a moment. She pulled me aside, her voice shaking slight. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully make up for the things I've done, but I want you to know I'm really trying. I've never felt like I've had a family, like I belonged in this way before." She paused, looking at me, her eyes filled with emotion. "I'm sorry for everything I put you through. For all the years of making you feel small. It was wrong, and I'll keep working to do better." I swallowed hard. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was a real one. It wasn't about excuses or deflection. It was just her, acknowledging the hurt she had caused and expressing her genuine desire to be better. "I appreciate you saying that," I told her. "Really do." Blake, who had been watching from the other room, came in quietly and wrapped his arm around me. He didn't say anything, but his presence spoke volumes. He had always been caught in the middle of Dorothy and me, unsure of how to navigate his love for both of us. But now, it felt like we were in a place where, finally, we could breathe. As the new year rolled in, I found myself not dreading family gatherings anymore. I wasn't bracing for the harsh words, the cutting remarks. Dorothy still wasn't perfect. She still made mistakes, but she was trying, and that was enough for me. I had spent so many years hoping she would change, but I never truly believed she could. Now, I was beginning to see that change was possible. Not overnight, not without setbacks, but it was happening. By spring, I realized the weight I had carried for so long was finally lifting. Dorothy had become someone I could talk to, someone who respected my boundaries. Our family, though not perfect, had found a new dynamic, one based on respect instead of manipulation. Blake and I still had our moments of doubt, moments when we wondered if this change would last. But in the end, we both knew that we had done our part. We had set the boundaries, spoken our truths, and given her the chance to prove herself. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what the future might hold. Lily, too, had noticed the difference. She no longer came home from family gatherings asking why Grandma acted the way she did. She talked about Dorothy with a softness in her voice, as though the woman she now knew was someone entirely different. And as I watched her laugh with Dorothy in the backyard that summer, I realized that sometimes change, no matter how hard or slow, was worth it. Not just for me, but for all of us. Blake and I sat together one evening, looking out at the backyard where Dorothy and Lily were playing. "You were right," Blake said quietly. "She's really trying. And that's all I ever wanted, to see her really try." I nodded, feeling the weight of the past year lift off my shoulders. Me too. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough, and in the end that was all we needed.